May 10, 1940, 4:30 hours, high above the Belgian frontier. The air is cold, but the interior of the DFS 230 glider is a cramped, sweat-filled cabin of silence. There are no engines here, only the whistling of the wind against stretched canvas and wood. 11 men sit straddling a central bench, their knuckles white as they grip their MP40s. They are the Granite Squad. Below them lies the dark, triangular shadow of Fort Ebenemehl, a massive underground complex widely considered the strongest fortress in the world. It is a labyrinth of steel, concrete, and 120mm cannons designed to hold off armies for months. Suddenly, the tow ropes snap. The gliders are on their own. They bank sharply, descending through the pre-dawn mist like birds of prey. In these few seconds, the concept of warfare is changing forever. The Belgian sentries below, listening for the roar of bombers, hear nothing but a faint, ghostly hiss. As the gliders skid across the grass-covered roof of the fort, the soldiers inside prepare to step out into a world that no longer recognizes the old rules. On this night, they are not just paratroopers. They are the specialists of a new age. On a hill in the Ardennes, a young lieutenant checks his watch. The seconds tick toward zero. In the silence of the gliders, these men are leaving behind the era of the infantrymen and entering the era of the operative. This is the moment they become Warborn. In the spring of 1940, the Western world was locked in a state of phony war, while Germany had devoured Poland in a matter of weeks. The border between the Third Reich and the Western Allies remained a stagnant line of concrete and steel. The prevailing military wisdom of the era, deeply scarred by the slaughter of the First World War, dictated that the defense was superior to the offense. France had invested billions of francs into the Maginot Line, a series of subterranean fortresses that were considered impenetrable. To the north, neutral Belgium relied on the Albert Canal and a crown jewel of defensive engineering, Fort Ebenemehl. Ebenemehl was not just a fort. It was a psychological anchor for the entire Allied strategy. Situated at the junction of the Meuse River and the Albert Canal, it commanded three vital bridges, Caen, Vroonhoven, and Veldwezelt. If Germany invaded, Ebenemehl's massive 120mm and 75mm guns would obliterate those bridges, trapping the German panzers on the wrong side of the water and giving the French and British armies time to move into position. The fort was a subterranean city, housing 1,200 soldiers behind walls of reinforced concrete up to 3.5 meters thick. It was protected by steep cliffs on one side and deep anti-tank ditches on the others. Conventional artillery could not scratch it. A traditional infantry assault would be a suicide mission. The world believed that as long as Ebenemehl stood, the heart of Europe was safe from the blitzkrieg. However, the solution to the Ebenemehl problem did not lie in the size of the German army, but in the precision of a secret unit. In late 1939, Hitler ordered the formation of Sturmabteilung Koch, an elite force of paratroopers and engineers named after their commander, Captain Walter Koch. For 6 months, these men disappeared from the face of the earth. They were sequestered in top-secret training camps in occupied Czechoslovakia and Germany, where life-sized mock-ups of the fort's gun turrets and casemates were constructed. The training was so secretive that the men were not allowed to use their real names, and even the pilots of the towing aircraft were kept in the dark about the final destination. This was the birth of the special operations mindset. While traditional infantry trained for the broad chaos of the battlefield, the men of Granite, the squad, specifically tasked with the roof of the fort, trained for the surgical destruction of individual steel domes. They practiced landing gliders in pitch darkness on postage stamp-sized targets. They learned the internal layout of Ebenemehl until they could navigate its corridors in their sleep. They were also introduced to a weapon that had never been used in combat, the hollow charge, shaped charge. This revolutionary explosive was designed to focus the blast energy into a narrow jet of molten metal capable of punching through several inches of armor plate, the exact thickness of the Belgian turrets. As the spring of 1940 arrived, the tension along the border reached a breaking point. The German plan was a masterpiece of deception. While the world expected a massive artillery barrage to signal the start of the war, Hitler's Warborn soldiers were preparing for a silent insertion. They were the tip of the spear for the most ambitious airborne operation in history. On the night of May 9th, the orders were cut. The gliders were assembled, the shaped charges were primed, and the men were told that the fate of the Third Reich rested on their ability to seize a fortress they had never seen in person. The phony war was about to end with a thunderclap that would redefine the limits of human audacity. The fall of Ibn Email is best understood through the technological angle of the shaped charge and the tactical angle of the glider assault. Before May 10, 1940, a concrete bunker was considered an absolute barrier. However, the German engineers introduced the Holading hollow charge. Unlike a standard block of TNT that explodes in all directions, the shaped charge was a hemispherical cone of explosive that directed its energy into a single, white-hot jet of pressure. This technological black magic allowed a small team of paratroopers to carry a 50 kilograms device that could penetrate 150 millimeters of steel armor in seconds. It turned the fort's greatest strength, its heavy armor, into a trap. The Belgian gunners inside were not killed by the explosion itself, but by the spalling effect, a shower of molten metal fragments and high-pressure gas that turned the interior of the turrets into a furnace. From the tactical angle, the German High Command realized that parachutes were too imprecise for a localized objective. A paratrooper dropped by parachute is at the mercy of the wind. Landing miles from his target and spending hours rallying his squad. By choosing the DFS 230 glider, the Germans achieved vertical precision. The glider acted as a silent, stealth transport that could land exactly on the roof of the fort, keeping the squad together as a single fighting unit from the moment they touched the ground. Tactically, this was the first instance of bypass warfare. By landing on top of the fort, the Fallschirmjäger rendered the Belgian minefields, anti-tank ditches, and barbed wire perimeters completely irrelevant. They didn't break down the front door, they dropped through the chimney. The human dimension of the assault reveals the human angle of the Fallschirmjäger and the psychological angle of the Belgian defenders. The German paratroopers of 1940 were not just soldiers. They were the first true Warborn specialists. Every man in Sturmabteilung was a hand-picked volunteer, trained to operate with total autonomy. In the darkness of the gliders, there was no room for traditional hierarchy if a commander died during the landing. The lowest-ranking private knew exactly which shaped charge to place on which turret. This level of decentralization allowed the small teams to move with a speed that paralyzed the enemy. They were trained to ignore the fog of war and focus on a singular, mechanical objective: the blinding of the fort. Conversely, the psychological angle of the Belgian garrison highlights the danger of fortress mentality. The 1,200 men inside Ibn Email were conditioned to believe they were safe. Their entire defensive doctrine was based on the idea that the enemy would be out there, visible, distant, and susceptible to artillery fire. When the German gliders landed silently on their roof, the Belgian soldiers experienced a total cognitive collapse. They were literally being attacked from nowhere. The sounds of heavy explosions vibrating through meters of concrete, explosions that should have been impossible, created a sense of supernatural dread. The garrison became victims of their own protection. Because they were underground, they could not see the small number of attackers, leading them to believe they were being besieged by a much larger force. This disparity between the hunter and the hunted was the decisive factor. The Germans were fighting a surgical war of the future, while the Belgians were fighting a static war of the past. As the first light of dawn touched the Albert Canal, the Warborn paratroopers were already moving across the concrete skin of the giant, turning its own strength against it. The transition from secret training to violent reality was complete, and the Belgian army was about to discover that their impenetrable shield was made of glass. At 4:25 a.m., the silent descent ended in a violent screech of wood and metal. The gliders of the Granite Section, led by Sergeant Major Rudolf Witzig, though he was delayed when his tow rope snapped, slammed into the dewy grass atop Ibn Email. One glider skidded across the plateau, its nose digging into the earth just meters from a twin 75mm gun turret. The Belgian sentries, finally spotting the ghostly shapes in the twilight, opened fire with light machine guns, But it was too late. The doors of the gliders burst open, and the Fallschirmjäger spilled out. They didn't seek cover. They ran directly toward their pre-assigned targets. The first objective was Objective 18, a massive observation dome and machine gun casemate. German pioneers sprinted across the concrete, ducking under the traverse of Belgian guns. They placed a 50-kilogram shaped charge directly on the steel cupola. A moment later, a pillar of white-hot flame punched through the armor. Inside the fort, the Belgian soldiers heard a sound like a lightning strike. The pressure wave killed the turret crew instantly, turning the compartment into a tomb of smoke and jagged metal. Within the first 10 minutes of the assault, 7 of the fort's primary defensive positions had been neutralized. The impenetrable fortress had been blinded before the main Belgian garrison even reached their battle stations. Chaos reigned in the subterranean tunnels. Major Jean Jatrin, the fort's commander, received frantic reports of men on the roof, but the internal communications were failing as the Germans systematically blew up the ventilation shafts and observation posts. The Belgian soldiers were trapped in a dark, echoing labyrinth, hearing the muffled thud of explosives above them. They fired their anti-aircraft guns at the gliders already on the ground, a futile gesture of defiance. By 5 a.m., the German paratroopers, fewer than 80 men, held the entire surface of the fort. They had successfully decapitated the most powerful defensive position in Europe, but the battle was far from over. 1,200 Belgian soldiers were still alive beneath their feet, preparing a counterattack. As the sun climbed higher, the situation for the Belgian garrison turned from confusion to catastrophe. Major Jatrin ordered his infantry to emerge from the underground tunnels to sweep the roof of the fort, but the German paratroopers had already turned the Belgian defensive positions against them. The Fallschirmjäger utilized the captured armored cupolas as cover, using their MG-34s to mow down any Belgian soldiers attempting to exit the sally ports. The Germans were no longer just attackers. They were the occupants of the high ground, and every meter of the plateau was now a kill zone controlled by elite marksmen. The most critical moment occurred at the Vroonhoven and Veldwezel bridges. While the Granite Group held the fort's roof, other glider sections landed directly onto the approaches of the vital canal crossings. The Belgian engineers, seeing the gliders land, rushed to detonate the demolition charges already wired to the bridges. At Vroonhoven, the German paratroopers were so fast that they shot the Belgian soldiers as their hands reached for the detonators. The bridge was seized intact. Only the Cam bridge was successfully blown, but the damage was done. The impenetrable line of the Albert Canal had been punctured in 2 places, and the road to the heart of Belgium was wide open. Inside the fort, the psychological breaking point was reached. The Germans began dropping smaller explosive charges down the ventilation shafts, pumping smoke and the smell of cordite into the living quarters. The Belgian garrison, fearing that the Germans were preparing to use poison gas or that the entire roof was about to be collapsed by heavy explosives, withdrew deeper into the lower levels. They were 1,200 men surrendered to the will of 78 by the morning of May 11th. After nearly 30 hours of isolation and the arrival of the German 4th Panzer Division S advance guard, Major Jatrin realized the futility of further resistance. The white flag was raised. The fort that was supposed to hold for months had fallen in just over a day, taken by a handful of men who had appeared from the clouds, sent a shockwave through the Allied high command that bordered on total paralysis. When the 1,200 Belgian defenders emerged from the tunnels to find they had been neutralized by a force of fewer than 80 paratroopers, this localized defeat had a massive strategic multiplier effect. Because the Vroonhoven and Veldwezel bridges were captured intact, the German 6th Army, spearheaded by the 4th Panzer Division, poured across the Albert Canal without a moment's delay. The carefully constructed Allied plan, the Dial plan, relied on the Belgian border defenses holding for days. Instead, the German armor was already deep in the Belgian interior before the British and French could even finish their initial deployments. The losses at Eben-Emael were numerically small. The Belgians lost 60 killed and 40 wounded, while the German Granite Squad lost only 6 men. But the strategic cost was the collapse of the entire Belgian defensive line. The world's newspapers, which had spent years praising the fort's invincible design, were suddenly filled with terrifying reports of a secret weapon or nerve gas used by the Germans. It meant that no rear area was safe. The French, watching from behind the Maginot Line, began to realize with growing dread that their own multi-billion-franc fortifications might be nothing more than expensive tombs. The success of the operation also secured the Fallschirmjäger's place as the elite darlings of the Third Reich. Hitler was ecstatic. He personally awarded the Knight's Cross to all 11 glider commanders and Captain Koch for the German military. Eben Emael was the ultimate proof of concept for the Blitzkrieg. It demonstrated that specialized vertical operations could achieve more in hours than entire army corps could achieve in weeks of traditional bombardment. The operation became the gold standard for special forces missions, establishing a blueprint for audacity and precision that would be studied by every major military for the next century. The era of the massed infantry charge was dying. The era of the surgical strike had arrived. The fall of Eben Emael did more than clear a path into Belgium. It shattered the fortress mentality that had dominated European military thought since the 19th century. In London and Paris, planners were forced to reckon with the fact that the English Channel and the Maginot Line were no longer absolute barriers. The success of the Warborn paratroopers proved that the third dimension, the sky, had rendered traditional geography obsolete. The British, who had been slow to develop their own airborne forces, immediately accelerated the formation of the parachute regiment, realizing that if they did not master the vertical battlefield, they would be conquered by it. For the Belgians, the loss was a national trauma. The fortress had been the symbol of their neutrality and their strength. Its rapid collapse led to a breakdown in cooperation between the Belgian, French, and British commands as fingers were pointed and accusations of incompetence flew. This internal friction served the German advance perfectly. The German panzer columns were already executing the famous sickle cut through the Ardennes, bypassed the Maginot Line entirely, and raced toward the English Channel. The night at Eben Emael was the spark that ignited the bonfire of the Third Republic. The stunning success of the gliders at Eben Emael gave Hitler an overconfident belief in the power of airborne troops. This would lead to the Pyrrhic victory at Crete in 1941, where the Fallschirmjäger suffered such horrific casualties that Hitler forbade further large-scale parachute operations. But for one night in May 1940, the world saw the future of war. The men who landed on that roof were the prototypes for the modern commando. Equipped with cutting-edge technology and a singular purpose, could achieve what an entire division of artillery could not. They were the first to prove that in the age of total war, it is not the wall that matters, but the man who knows how to leap over it. The silence of the early morning on May 10, 1940, was the last moment of a world that still believed in the safety of shadows and the permanence of walls. When those gliders touched the grass of Eben Emael, they didn't just land on a fortress. They landed on the 19th century and crushed it. The night these soldiers became Warborn remains a haunting study in the vulnerability of strength. It reminds us that no matter how deep the concrete or how thick the steel, a defense is only as strong as its ability to adapt to the unexpected. For history, Eben Emael serves as the birth certificate of the modern special operator. It moved the focus of war away from the sheer weight of numbers and toward the precision of the scalpel. The paratroopers of Sturmabteilung Koch were the first to demonstrate that information, technology, and audacity could act as a force multiplier capable of toppling giants. They showed that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't a 120mm cannon, but a soldier who has been trained to believe that the impossible is merely a tactical problem waiting for a solution. Today, the fort stands as a hollowed-out monument to a vanished era. Its guns are silent, its corridors are cold, and the grass on its roof has grown back over the skid marks of the gliders. But the lesson of that night echoes in every modern airborne jump and every covert raid. We live in a world where the vertical threat is a constant reality, a world shaped by the men who stepped out of the darkness and proved that the sky was no longer a ceiling, but a door.